No mai, haere mai. Welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast. My name is Jason, and I'm the Communications Manager at Maxim Institute. This is our weekly short-form podcast. These podcasts are released in tandem with our weekly column and are a chance for you to hear in depth from the column's author about some of the thinking that went into producing their final piece. Today we talk to researcher Maryanne Spurdle about her latest column. Maryanne, welcome to the podcast. Good to have you with us.
Hi, Jason.
We are talking about your latest column for Maxim, Why Choice in Education Really Is Choice. Now, you make the point in your column that many children aren't getting the education they need in New Zealand. And we've seen this with reports over the years of results slipping down. The PISA results often are not favourable to New Zealand. And there are two narratives out there as to how we might go about fixing this. And you outline them a little bit, but you just want to dig into them for us here and help me understand what they are.
Well, the one is obviously let's give more funding to the Ministry of Education. Let's get more teachers on board. Just the more of what we're doing.
Okay.
More of that.
Yep. Which, as we see from PISA scores, hasn't really been working.
It really is doing what we've been doing.
Yes.
There's nothing new about that. The other is to do what actually the majority of the developed world is doing, which is to publicly fund independently operated schools.
Yes.
And different countries do it in different ways.
Yes.
There's only one country that spends less of its percentage of school funding on independently operated schools, and that's Mexico. Then New Zealand.
We know how well they're doing.
Yeah, Mexico's education system is not world renowned for excelling.
For the results. Yeah. Now, you say that some of these countries have been doing this for a while. Like you say, Sweden's system is just as old as Shortland Street.
They've had vouchers, voucher system since the 1990s.
Wow.
They've had quite a broad program for that long. In the 1990s, charter schools began opening in the States.
Yeah.
With resistance from the status quo, but they still are now about 7% of students in the US, and not all states have charter schools. Most do now. And on average, 7% of students attend them. And there are plenty more who would like to, but they're generally oversubscribed. The supply, because it costs a lot to start up a school, hasn't kept up with the demand. And there are different restrictions in different areas. In the UK, it's been over 20 years since the first independently operated public schools started operating, and they've got academies and free schools, which are now serving 51% of students. So that's more students going to independently operated schools than their equivalent of the Ministry of Education run schools.
Okay, so how would that, if we manage to catch up to this, 30 years old system that we're kind of behind, if we manage to implement something like that, what would that be like here in New Zealand? I mean, as much as we know, I guess, because we don't have legislation or anything like
so
that.
Charter schools are, again, on the cards. The charter schools that were introduced 10, 11 years ago, started operating 10 years ago, they weren't really fully the kind of charter schools you see in the States. They had a very limited purpose for being. They had to have the majority of the students enrolled priority students, so they couldn't just be Montessori school or Catholic school. They actually had to specifically serve underserved students. And at the peak, there were only a dozen of them operating with fewer than 1,500 students. So it was a very small rollout, and the plug was pulled very quickly. The other thing to note about charter schools, because I think some people think, we've had partnership schools, we've tried that, they failed. They didn't fail. They're actually still operating.
Yeah.
Even the one that lost its charter is still a publicly funded school. Most of them are designated character schools now. So they're still publicly funded. They're still operating. Some of them have had great success. The problem the first time around was the Ministry of Education, even though apparently it had an evaluation tool developed, like a tool that speak of the Credo research coming out of the States, where they compare students from the same socioeconomic background in the same area and then look at the progression of students in public schools and students in charter schools. In the US, that has shown over the 15 years that Credo has been doing it very clearly, the students who are in charter schools are far more likely to progress further. And
they're from the same socioeconomic background, but just the difference is private
and not
school
every
versus
student
public.
does.
Yeah.
Some do better in public schools. Only about 14%, though, of those that they survey, which is pretty much, it's a coin flip would get you higher numbers.
Yeah.
So the odds are much better that they will improve in a charter school. And the students who are most likely to improve in charter schools in the States are the ones who are underserved. Unfortunately, the method they had developed to do that was never implemented. So we don't actually have that kind of data from the schools that operated 10 years ago. And there's this narrative, kind of floating about that they failed because the plug was pulled. The plug wasn't pulled because they weren't functioning well. It was an ideological decision that a new government made. The schools are still operating. They're still doing fine. They're still publicly funded. The charter schools that are being proposed this time around wouldn't be limited to a specific type of school. It would be any school, public, state integrated, private, and new school. They could apply for a charter, and the way that would work, details pending, but the way it would work is that they agree, we're going to have these outcomes, so that they basically promise to do at least as well as a public school.
Yeah.
Unlike public
so in a
schools,
charter, that would set out what the educational outcomes are going to be. So we promise to do X, Y, Z.
Yeah, they're delivering a service.
Yes.
So, a student going from year 5 to year 6 needs to show this kind of,
Yeah.
however they end up doing that. Unlike a public school, if the outcomes aren't good, then they don't get their charter renewed.
Okay. And the charter is what they get their funding for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what we know so far is the funding will be tethered to public school funding. Shouldn't be an issue. The study out of the States, on average, charter schools there get 5,700 New Zealand dollars per student a year less.
Okay.
And like I said, the outcomes on average are better.
Yeah, because that's the big question that everyone has, right? Is we're going to spend millions, maybe billions of dollars more on these extra schools. Yeah, it's schools that are independent, that no one's overseeing. So take us through that. How are they going to be overseen so that we're not just flushing money down the toilet?
The details haven't been spelled out yet. That'll be in the legislation.
Yes.
But it'll be some version of, there needs to be evaluation of students to see what the outcomes are. There will be predetermined standards. ERO, which evaluates public schools, will also, the various standards that schools have to meet to operate, they'll be in place. And the other thing that people forget is, if they're not good schools, parents will not choose to send their kids there. So the schools won't continue. If they get funding for students who come and students don't come, they can't
don't get
operate.
funding.
Yeah. So that's where the choice kind of comes in.
So you tether the funding to a student rather than to a school. So if my son goes to one school, that school gets funding for him there. But if he moves to another school, which we hope will help him further his education, the funding just goes to that school.
Which is pretty much the way things work now. So the idea that, if you're putting money into independently operated schools, you're taking it out of the public system. It's not a very good argument, because if 10 students leave and go to another school and take their funding with them, well, you don't need the funding for those 10 students.
Yeah.
And unlike state integrated schools, you're not having to come up with the money for your own buildings that's state funded anyway. And if buildings need repurposing, they can be repurposed. So really, it's same. You still need the same amount of money and the same number of teachers and the same building spaces. It just gets reshuffled between providers. Now, less is going to be going via the establishment channels if things become more devolved. That's true. But what are we trying to accomplish here? Good education.
Yeah, that's right.
The channel doesn't matter unless you're, for some reason, attached to a certain channel.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you do make the point that this is a great sentence that I really like. We're captive to a 20th century bureaucratic appendages propping up a 19th century system. How do we move into the 21st century here? Because we're 2 centuries behind.
And I don't think we have to move ourselves. There are
Yes.
excellent educators and principals and community groups and iwi out there doing this kind of work. The trouble is it's very expensive to run a school. So setting it up and being allowed to run it, there are a lot of hurdles to overcome. And if you're a private school, you've got the added hurdle of having to charge tuition. So this is why other countries are going, look, there are good institutions that are providing good education. We'd have more equitable access to them if they got public funding, and then we're allowed to continue doing what they're doing. So that's, as far as the student and the family goes, the best scenario where you've got the options, you're paying your taxes, your child gets to be a student at whichever school suits them best, rather than this is where you can afford to live or where you can afford to send them. And this one system determines what your options are.
Because we all know one system doesn't fit everyone.
No. And even within the system, the idea is that there should be accommodation for special needs and for many other things, that the ideal is there and it's great, but the reality doesn't meet it. And even special education provision is really restricted. So there are schools out there that are dedicated to special learning needs, to remote education, to things that they're not allowed. So designated character status allows you to be fully funded while having a special character. There are still some limitations. It's a little bit hybrid. But only a few dozen schools have been permitted that status. A lot of them are the former charter schools who are permitted that as kind of okay, then you can keep operating fully funded. Technically, on paper, within the current system, that could happen, but it doesn't, because the Ministry of Education prioritizes their own remote learning platform and the schools that they have now. It's not designed to do what independent operators can do.
Well, thanks for sharing, Maryanne, and we'll continue to keep an eye on the space and see how it all develops in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. Who profits when independent schools are shut out? 2 contrasting narratives are swirling around the education space. 1, radical forces are preparing to destroy our fragile public education system. The other, fossilized elements of its structure aren't fit for purpose and change is necessary. But whether you want to double down on the current direction, translation, more cash, or open the door to different approaches, hello charter schools, we all agree that too many children aren't getting the education they need. Those attached to the status quo ignore the compelling evidence that students benefit from educational ecosystems far more diverse than ours. Everything from long-term research out of Stanford University to international OECD studies supports what, internationally, is a decades-old trend. After New Zealand, Mexico is now the only OECD country that spends a smaller percentage of education funding, 0, on independent schools. How is that working out for Mexico? It's dead last in the OECD's tertiary attainment rate for young adults, many of whom you'll find heading across their northern border. By 2012, the majority of OECD governments were contributing more than half of independent schools' income. In England, 51% of students now attend publicly funded, privately operated schools. Sweden's school voucher system is as old as Shortland Street. In Australia, state and national governments generously supplement tuition at Catholic schools, teaching 20% of all students, and independent schools, teaching 16% of students, compared to 4% in New Zealand. Charter schools began in the US in the 1990s, and despite resistance from the establishment, have proved most popular in the least privileged areas. Far from depleting educational coffers, they receive 5,700 New Zealand dollars a year less per student, on average, than public schools. And their quality? Stanford's Center for Research on Education Outcomes weighed in definitively in 2023. Comparing students from identical socioeconomic backgrounds, those in charter schools were significantly more likely to progress further. Crucially, disadvantaged students benefited the most. It's been 10 years since the previous attempt to introduce charter schools in New Zealand. That small initiative only allowed a dozen schools to serve, at their peak, fewer than 1,500 priority students. Contrary to popular myths, the schools did not fail. In fact, they're still operating and still publicly funded, most as designated character schools. Raewyn Tipene is principal of one, Te Kapahu Whatu in Whangarei. Her take? "We came back to mainstream and it was horrendous," she told RNZ. Despite retaining full funding in the niche designation, she still speaks of burdensome bureaucracy and the ministry's unresponsiveness to building needs. By contrast, she said that operating as a charter school was, quote, "one of the first times I've experienced what freedom felt like. You were given resources, you were told, here's what you need to achieve, how you do that's your business, and we overachieved." New Zealand will never be able to claim a world-class education system if it remains captive to 20th century bureaucratic appendages propping up a 19th century system. Educational choice is not novel and it's not risky. The only question left is how.
Thanks for listening to the Maxim Institute podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us and keep up with the rest of our research and analysis of politics and policy in New Zealand, you can sign up on the homepage of our website to get our monthly forum email and invitations to future Maxim Institute events. You can search and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. From the team at Maxim, mā te wā, goodbye for now.